There are 298 prisoners on death row in the state of Florida. This is part 3 of the series. Bruce Pace, 64 years old, 34 years on death row. On November 4, 1988, Barbara Mack spoke with her father Floyd Covington over the radio while he was driving his taxi. She tried using the same radio later that day, but couldn't get through to him. The victim's daughter-in-law, Frankie Covington, reported a missing person to the Santa Rosa Sheriff's Office on November 7th. The missing taxi driver was put on the police search list. A white Buick station wagon belonging to Mr. Covington was discovered in a rural area. A mass of brush had been piled over it. The driver's seat occupant had been shot from the passenger seat, as was evident from the bloodstains in the cab. The blood type was discovered to be 0, which matched Mr. Covington's blood type. Covington had been in the driver's seat when he was shot twice in the chest with a shotgun and then transferred to the passenger seat. On November 10th, Mr. Covington's body was discovered 12 miles away in another wooded location. About 20 feet from the body, his wallet was also found. Pace informed his stepfather that on the morning of November 4, 1988, Mr. Covington had drove him home. Pace was compelled to enter the home through a window because he was missing his key. When he finally entered, he discovered that the shotgun rack was missing his brother's shotgun. Pace stated that someone approached him from behind and choked him, knocking him out. He claimed to have awoken in the woods. When he saw his brother's shotgun, he took it. He observed blood in Mr. Covington's taxi. He then took a stroll over the Green's house. Pace went to the sheriff's office on his own initiative after telling his stepfather all of this information. Milford Bird, 74 years old, 41 years on death row. Bird was found guilty of killing his wife, Deborah Bird, and he was given the death penalty. On October 13, 1981, Deborah Bird's body was discovered strangled inside the Tampa motel that she and her husband ran. Deborah had numerous non-fatal injuries, including 4 gunshot wounds, bruising, and scalp abrasions, according to the medical examiner. Bird stated in his testimony to police that he had gone to the gym and a few bars the night of the murder and discovered his wife dead when he got home at 6:45 a.m. Bird was asking about his wife's $100,000 life insurance policy and how long it would take for the claim to be settled shortly after the murder. Ronald Sullivan, a resident of Bird's motel, was detained on 27th of October for violating his parole. He was then charged with killing Deborah. Sullivan's comments to the police led to Bird's arrest on October 28, 1981, in relation to the murder of Deborah. Without a warrant, police officers detained Bird on the basis of probable cause. Bird asserted in the police station that if he could speak to his girlfriend in private, he would give a statement regarding the murder. Detectives finally gave in, and Bird reported the following details. He had developed feelings for his new girlfriend, and Deborah would not allow him to get a divorce. Bird admitted that he had talked to Sullivan and James Andress, who was Sullivan's roommate, about killing his wife. Bird made an offer of $5,000 for them to plan the murder and make it appear to be a robbery. According to Bird, he wasn't there when the murder was committed. In exchange for a plea deal, Sullivan turned state's evidence against Bird and testified against him in court. He said that all 3 of them were present and they took turns at strangling Deborah. Alfonso Cave, 65 years old, 41 years on death row. Frances Julia Slater was just 18 years old when she was abducted and murdered. John Bush, J.B. Parker, Terry Wayne Johnson, and Cave departed for Pierce, Florida on the evening of April 26, 1982, and they traveled by car to Stuart, Florida. They arrived in Stuart that evening at 11 p.m. On April 27, at around 3 in the morning, the 4 arrived at a Stuart convenience shop. Cave and 2 of the men entered the shop, and Cave threatened Slater with a revolver and demanded the money. The men took the money, then kidnapped Slater and put her in the backseat of the car. She was taken out of the car by the 4 men when they arrived to a rural area. She was then stabbed by one of the men, and while she was falling, another man shot her once in the back of the head, killing her instantly. The man left the area and headed toward Fort Pierce before being stopped by police due to a broken tail light about an hour later. When the car and its passengers were connected to the convenience store robbery, they were apprehended. J. Parker, 61 years old, 40 years on death row. He was one of the co-defendants in the case of Julia Slater. Parker was convicted of first-degree murder, robbery with a firearm, and kidnapping, and in 1982 was sentenced to death for the murder conviction. After 11 appeals, he was resentenced to death in 2000. Kyle Bates, 65 years old, 40 years on death row. On the afternoon of June 14, 1982, Bates abducted 24-year-old Janet Renee White from her office, took her into a wooded area behind the building, attempted to assay her, then stabbed her to death, and removed a diamond ring from one of her fingers. At his original trial in 1983, a jury recommended 11-1 that Bates be sentenced to death. He has been sentenced to die 2 other times, once in 1985 and again in 1995. His latest appeal focused on a ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States stating all death recommendations have to be unanimous from juries, and that juries, not judges, are who have the ultimate say in death penalty cases. Milo Rose, 73 years old, 40 years on death row. Robert Richardson was killed on October 18, 1982, when Milo Rose, who was residing with Richardson's mother, hit him in the head with a concrete block. Witnesses claimed that because of the area's good light, they could easily see Rose. They also said that earlier that evening, while hearing the sound of breaking glass, they had spotted Rose and Richardson going down the street. They saw Rose taking up a concrete block while Richardson lay on the ground. According to them, he lifted the concrete block above his head and repeatedly hurled it down on Richardson's head 5 or 6 times. Rose and Mrs. Richardson were hosting 2 more guests. They picked up Rose, who was traveling on a nearby street shortly after the murder. They learned from Rose that he had murdered Robert Richardson. Rose was detained by the police at the apartment he and Mrs. Richardson shared. Joel Wright, 66 years old, 40 years on death row. The 75-year-old Lima Smith's body was found in her bedroom on February 6, 1983. Smith's brother discovered her dead after growing concerned when she didn't answer the door. Smith had been assayed as well as repeatedly stabbed in the face and neck. Joel Wright visited Charles Westbury's home on the morning of February 6, 1983, and confessed to killing Smith, according to Westbury, a state witness. In order to steal money from her pocketbook, Wright admitted that he broke into her house through an open window. Wright acknowledged killing her as a result of her ability to recognize him after seeing him in the corridor. He made it known that he didn't want to return to jail or prison. He then requested an alibi from Westbury. When Westbury told his wife about the situation a few weeks later, she called the police. Wright's fingerprint was found at the Smith's house. Apparently, that was not the first time he had broken into the residence. Derek Smith, 61 years old, 33 years on death row. Smith was found guilty of murdering Jeffrey Songer and given the death penalty. Derek Smith and Derek Johnson committed a heist that they had planned in advance on March 21, 1983. In accordance with their plan, Smith made a cab request from a payphone at a restaurant in St. Petersburg. The 2 males were picked up by cab driver Jeffrey Songer after they asked to be driven to a neighboring residential area. Songer grew suspicious and radioed his dispatch an emergency code. His dispatch sent a second cab driver and the police to respond to his call. Songer was discovered laying about 70 feet from the automobile, dead from a gunshot wound to the back, by the police and the other cab driver. Smith and Johnson were identified thanks to a witness. He testified that Songer attempted to flee the taxicab and that Smith shot him in the back. Another witness claimed during the trial that Smith held him and his wife at gunpoint in their motel room while using a weapon resembling the one Songer was killed with. Smith was given a life sentence after entering a guilty plea to those accounts. Songer's murder weapon was never discovered. However, Smith's uncle claimed that a gun of the same sort a .38 caliber revolver that numerous witnesses claim to have seen Smith carrying just before the murder, was gone from his house. In addition, the authorities were able to determine that Sanger was killed with the same kind of bullet that Smith's uncle had purchased from his missing gun. On the restaurant payphone that had been used to call for the cab, Smith's fingerprints were also discovered. He admitted to selling Johnson the gun the day before the murder over the course of the investigation. While Smith acknowledges that he did call for the taxi, he maintains that he changed his mind about the robbery and decided not to go at the last minute. Robert Peede, 79 years old, 39 years on death row. On March 30th, 1983, Robert Ira Peede rode his motorbike from Hillsborough, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, hoping to convince his estranged wife Darla Peede to accompany him back to North Carolina. He intended to use Mrs. Peede as a decoy to lure Geraldine, his ex-wife, and Calvin Wagner, her boyfriend at the time, to a motel where he would murder them. He flew to Miami, Florida after selling his motorcycle. Peede contacted Darla around 5:15 p.m. and asked her to pick him up at the airport. Darla agreed, but before she went, she gave her daughter specific instructions to phone the police and give them the car's license plate number if she hadn't returned by midnight. Darla also gave her daughter the phone numbers for Geraldine and the Hillsborough Police Department. Darla was afraid that if she had to go back to North Carolina, she would be slaughtered along with the others. She deliberately only carried her handbag when she left her house. Peede claimed that Darla had picked him up at the airport. She was then instructed to travel north on Interstate 95 by him. The two entered the turnpike in the wrong direction toward Orlando. The song Swinging started playing on the radio at some point. Peede slashed Darla in the side with his knife because he thought she and Geraldine had posted an advertisement for S partners in the national publication Swinger. They started talking about Peede's idea on the Swingers magazine ad. Peede pulled over the vehicle on the side of the road, about 5 or 6 miles outside of Orlando, hopped into the back seat, and stabbed Darla in the neck. She bled to death from this wound in 5 to 15 minutes. Peede kept on driving toward North Carolina. In Camden, Georgia, he dumped Darla's body in a forested location. At some point during the trip, Peede threw his knife out the window. Peede's shotgun was loaded and next to the door when he was apprehended, indicating that he still intended to kill Geraldine and Calvin. Peede was taken into custody at his Hillsborough, North Carolina residence. Darla's vehicle was parked in front of his house. The inside of the car was extensively bloodied. Peede confessed to killing Darla by stabbing her in the throat in a written document. He also demanded that the death penalty be applied and that it be executed as soon as possible. That is all for today, guys. I just want to apologize for the voice. I caught a cold and this is the reason why I did not post any video on Monday. I hoped that my voice would get better. Apparently it didn't, so here we are. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful day. See you next time. Bye bye.